Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another Principles Only episode of Capitals Uncovered. And today we, led by Pelle, are going to be exploring how we got to where we are in the Persian Gulf, why the world is on the brink of a global confrontation with Iran, how deep the roots go. And they go back a long way. And they go back all the way. They didn't start with America. They didn't start with Israel or with Russia. They started with Winston Churchill and the British Empire and Churchill's touching imperial confidence that Britain had the divine right to all the oil resources of Iran rather than its own people, and that any democratic constitutional efforts on the part of the Iranian people to assert their rights to national control of their own wealth were monstrous and contemptible and as bad as anything the Nazis ever did. We go back, therefore, to the Mosaddegh coup of 1953 and the story behind it. My co-host and good friend, Pelle Neroth Taylor, has been investigating this with his usual formidable and brilliant, careful forensic examination. And Pelle is going to guide us through the far too suppressed, forgotten, ignored story of what really happened and the lessons it has for today. Take it away, Pelle.
Well, I got onto the subject because of my interest in 1950s British imperial policy, the good old the Hammarskjöld story, where in a way the Americans were pushing this poor Swedish Secretary General in front of them. And it really was a kind of conflict again between the Americans and the British to some extent that couldn't dare not speak its name because they were old friends from the alliance in World War II, and because Britain was important. There was a lot of soft power and a lot of sympathy, for the Brits, same language, similar culture, and also because the Brits were an important keystone power in NATO. So they were sort of adversaries on the colonial front and friends in the European sphere, and the British were regarded themselves and were one of the big three in 1945, but only in a fragile sense. They'd won the war, but the Soviets had bled most of the manpower, and the Americans were fighting most of the doing most of the economic war, and they fought the war in the Pacific. But after World War II, I think the Americans hadn't taken the step out into becoming an empire, really. And the story about Iran, in a way, in 1953, is not only about how the Mossadegh episode alienated the Iranians and actually eventually led to the rise of Islamic radicalism, because the Iranians felt that they'd tried liberalism or constitutionalism and nationalism, and it had failed. The British had quashed it. So in a way, that was it was not only that, but it was also the way how the Brits inveigled. My take on it is how the Brits inveigled the Americans into empire and let them take the blame. And in a way, placed them in a position where they would have bad relationships with the whole Middle East. In a way, in the same way that Israel has sort of done since. But it's a very interesting story because it leads on to my Hammarskjöld fascination, because that was the Hammarskjöld was seen by the British as representing communist Soviet takeover of the rich mineral resources of Katanga, the southern region of Congo, which had atomic uranium and fantastic copper and all that. And that the Americans, the Brits, to their friends in America, said that the Soviets are going to invade us. And the Soviets are going to expand their power. So they were constantly framing their colonial interests, their rearguard fight against mainly African, Middle Eastern, Asian nationalism for right to their own mineral resources, as a battle against Soviet expansion, because they basically, what they did was they painted nationalists of these countries who wanted the resources, quite rightfully, that had been the British were exploiting. I mean, in Iran in 1950s, the forerunner of BP, British Petroleum, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British exchequer was taking like 5 times as much money from the AIOC than the Iranians got. And on top of that, the AIOC shareholders got their fair share. I mean, they were sharing almost nothing of the oil underneath on Iranian soil with the Iranians themselves. So the nationalists, of whom the prime minister of the late 1940s, Mossadegh, was one, said, well, we want some of that, especially as the Americans were relatively generous when they negotiated with Saudi Arabia, giving a 50-50 share. So the Iranians say, well, why are we only getting 5% or 10% when our next door neighbors are getting 50-50? So the British were very keen to sort of paint that, saying, well, Americans were saying, well, hang on, you should. The Americans, of course, were interested in expanding their power, and the British Empire, to some extent, stood in the way. The British Americans were not angels, but they wanted, I guess, a capitalist world where they could trade, and they felt that if the British Empire fell away, American business would benefit. So it wasn't sort of. I guess there was some idealism in the American part. I mean, some tradition, some idea that every nation fighting for its independence against the British, of whom there were dozens in the 1940s and 50s, maybe over 100, were in some way tiny little Americas, because, of course, America's founding myth was that they'd fought the evil redcoats in 1776. So there's a lot of that for the American establishment in those new countries to play on. And, of course, the British counter-narrative is the Soviets are going to take over the whole world if you don't help us, and so they're not nationalists. They are communists in disguise. So they worked very, very hard to find a Stalinist or communist link to practically every country they were dealing with. So I dealt extensively with Katanga and Congo. Hammarskjöld, the Swedish Secretary General, was basically trying to bring together the different factions of Congo and unite them so it could leave that damn conflict and go to Berlin and deal with the Cold War. But the British refuses to cede the Katanga, which is the southern region, which was all the mineral-rich region, which was linked financially to the Rhodesia. A lot of British Suez group, the Tories that were very close to the sort of revanchist wing of the Tory party, they saw Hammarskjöld's attempt to bring Katanga and its minerals into pan-Congo fold as a communist advance, because one of the factions in Congo, northern Congos, did have some pro-Russian links, but it was massively exaggerated. But you can find a diary entry from Macmillan on the 15th of September 1961 saying, if Hammarskjöld succeeds, everything that we fought for in Africa will be lost. And of course, I think they were worried that the Americans and the UN were going to decolonize the rest of the British colonies for them. Okay, so that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years, or one of my projects. Well, Iran is remarkably similar, because what happened, this is 10 years earlier. My Congolese project was 1961. This is 1951, 52, 53. The British, the Anglo-Iranian, were running this huge, 85% of the Royal Navy's oil came from Iran, and the British still had a worldwide empire. And they could buy this oil in sterling, which means they could just print money to pay for it, a bit like the Americans could do today. And if they wanted American oil, they needed to buy in dollars. So Britain was very cash-strapped and could ill afford to share it with, or they didn't want to share it with the Iranians. So this guy called Mosaddegh appears on the scene, and he says, we want a fair share of the oil. He rejected the Russian overtures, so he was not. If you actually look at the documentation, he was not pro-Russian at all. He just wanted the Iranians to be independent of both the Russians and the British. In a way, there's a kind of Ukrainian angle here, because he was not. He said he rejected. The Soviets gave them very generous offers to exploit Iranian oil on the Iran's behalf. Mossadegh said no. Declassified papers from Moscow show that the Russians distrust and disliked Mossadegh because he was a bourgeois nationalist who had Iran's interests at play. But what happens is the British in 1951, when he started to demand a greater share of this Anglo-Iranian oil condominium, which was run sort of on race lines, basically. If you're a leftist, you could say that it was an island off the coast of Iran called Abadan, which was like a British fortress of upper class bungalows, and then Iranians living in very, very poor conditions. And I guess it wasn't a formal color bar or anything, but if you, I think it's a grievance for Iranians who are very proud of their civilization, and they'll harken back to it. So a number of Iranian historians, mostly living in America, have written about this with a strong sense of bitterness. That the British looked down on them, and they had their own compounds, their own garden parties, and so on. But anyway, be that what they may, Abadan was this jewel in the crown of the British oil industry. Basically, it was supplied an enormous amount. So Mossadegh wanted a fair share of that exploitation, at least 50-50. And the British basically decided that this can't happen. We've got to get rid of Mossadegh. And they started with this campaign, this media campaign, and you can read the diplomatic archives, and it's echoed in the headlines of this time of you know, Mossadegh being this filthy Dago bandit, wog, bad guy, communist, and a guy who walked around in his pajamas all day long and smoked opium. And I think the diplomats genuinely believed it. I mean, they were using this kind of language to each other, but there was a very, very strong press campaign and papers that we think of as liberal today, like The Observer, which is run by David Astor, who was basically an MI6 asset. And then what happened was that they suggested they bribed the bazaris, they call them, the merchants of Tehran, to carry out the coup and to get the Shah to write his signature on a piece of paper that would deposit Mossadegh and replace them with someone who was more amenable to the British. Uh, this didn't happen. He couldn't persuade the Shah, and they tried to get the Americans on board. And they failed initially, but eventually they succeeded. They got a guy called Kermit Roosevelt, who was I think he was grandson of Teddy Roosevelt.
He was.
Yeah, and I'm only reading up on the details, but basically what the British paid for, they paid the imams. So the Shah's feisty sister said, there's a saying going around in Tehran that if you lift an imam's beard, you'll see the words "Made in Britain" stamped on his chin. So they were agitating in the mosques. They paid protesters to burn down pro-Mossadegh newspapers. And there's an interview with a guy called Darbyshire in a documentary from 1985. The transcript, which was cut, but the transcript of which has only recently surfaced, saying, we organized this, the British did it, I put all the actors in place when it happened. And finally, and one of the revelations, I mean, the official story is that the Shah finally put his signature he went away. It's confusing and it's detailed, but he went away, he came back from Europe, and he put his signature to dismiss Mossadegh. And then Mossadegh and his cabinet were put in jail, relatively short sentences, basically. But anyway, apparently that signature was forged by the British. That's also come out in the Derbyshire interview. This was published in the National Security Archive in America. This transcript of this interview, which surfaced, a copy sitting in somewhere in Iran, and it was made the centerpiece of a documentary called Coup 53 by one of Iran's most famous film directors. And I put the link in the bottom. It's had very good reviews. It's had endorsements from people like, I don't think, Errol Morris and so on. So but of course, it's completely gone in the mainstream. But the point of my article is mainly how because the British never release anything, and it's only because of this Derbyshire release, this transcript, this interview that was cut by a British film team, they didn't use it, and then the transcript itself surfaced in Iran decades later. It's only that we know. That's one of our main pieces of evidence for British involvement with all the details. There's some in Foreign Office archives, which a guy called Abraham Mahamiam has pulled together and has written in an article in a Western journal. Anyway, the point is, the Americans took the blame for some of this, partly because Kermit Roosevelt was self-dramatizing, partly because the Americans are more open about revealing their bad things. So it's come out in the end. Their whole sorry contribution to the saga came out in the year 2000. A guy called James Risen, writing in the New York Times, wrote where it was basically a CIA operation, and he left out much of the British involvement. So the British. The reason why the Brits don't cop the blame is that they're much more discreet, they're much more prudent, and they're much smarter than the Americans, and they let the Americans take the blame for it, or some of these covert ops that define decolonization that have actually, I mean, are relatively well known, like the Arbens and so on. That might have been Americans, but at least some of them are British, and I think it'd be a good thing if the British got to know these things, because it might create some kind of political pressure to I think Britain needs a kind of church commission, just as America's had, a kind of reckoning with its security state, which now, for instance, there's a big debate in Britain about whether Starmer should spend more on defence after the resignation of the defence secretary and his assistant minister. And that's obviously a play by the British deep state because Starmer is insufficiently keen on war with Russia. So I think that there needs to be more about that. But it's also important for Iran because the Brits and the Americans were big powers. um, they move on and go on to the next thing. But for the Iranians, I mean, I think I read articles in Spectator and so on in the 80s and 90s of astonished British journalists saying the Iranians attribute to us these amazing things which we never heard of, and they hadn't because it wasn't part of a British journalist education. And so the journalists see the MI6 hands of MI6 anywhere, but they might have a case for it. And the point is, once Mossadegh was got rid of, this moderate. And in fact, you see that if the declassified CIA documentation that came out in 2017 says he's not a communist, Moscow dislikes him, he doesn't like Moscow, he's a moderate, he's a conservative, he's a constitutionalist. Um, the idea of Mossadegh as being this filthy dago with links to Stalin still lingers. But anyway, the thing is, for the Iranians, the idea of a nationalist constitutionalism or liberalism, you could even call it. I mean, he was a bourgeois, he was a conservative from the upper classes. They said, well, Khamenei, famously killed recently, the supreme leader who took over from Khamenei, he wrote as a young cleric in 1981, we came to power, but they're not going to snuff us out like they snuffed out Mossadegh. So they're basically, and I think that was some of their attraction for the
Oh, a lot of it.
liberals, because they said we're not biddable and we're too strong for the liberals. And anyway, liberalism doesn't work, and that's sort of been a theme, hasn't it, Martin, that we've talked over the years, that somehow these countries are forced into what from us we create these monsters because we kill off or topple their moderates, and then when somebody who is a hardliner comes to power, we said, we told you so. All these countries can do is elect hardliners because they're not civilized like us. And in a way, that's what happened with
Exactly.
Iran, I think. So I think that there are lessons there both for people interested in history, a lesson to the British and a lesson to the because also one of the things that we often talk about, I mean, we haven't even made our own minds up yet. Who's responsible for all this stuff? Is it the Brits or is it the Americans? And in a lot of the podcasts, they'll blame the Americans, and a minority of them, like Alex Crane, I think, is all roads lead to London. Anyway, I mean, I'm not quite made my mind up on it actually, but anyway, I mean, I think it's good that there's much. I think if Britain is at a crossroads, um, intellectually, where it's going and where it's been in the 20th century, and with many prime ministers the last couple of years, and a total dishonesty in the public debate and a lot of censorship and so on. I think that sort of discussion is actually going to be pretty useful. So I'm putting that out in my Substack, and I'll link to it at the bottom of this show. Anyway, what are your thoughts, Martin? I mean, you've obviously you've got your own angles and your own take on the Middle East situation. So I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you, Pele, I think, because I fully agree with you. I don't have anything I think significant to add. I think that was a masterly presentation. And of course, I do have points to add from my own observations and experience, but they confirm, I think, everything you've pointed out and said. Uh, I am of an age, I think I must be at least 20, 25 years at least older than you, probably more. But I go back in the region, kind of knocking around the Middle East back in the mid 1970s. And what is was one of the many things that was fascinating to me then. You and I, for all our academic background and historical passions, are both basically newsmen and journalists at heart. And we've both been deeply marinated in our personal experience of major centers like London, Brussels, Washington, New York, Moscow in my case, Stockholm in yours, where we have actually been. And therefore, we know that being on the ground and talking to people who are actually, if not players, or at least the courtiers around the power players, makes a huge difference. You learn. And in the 1970s, I was struck by the number of I mean, the Middle East, of course, was saturated wherever you went, especially if you're from Britain or Ireland, or America, of course, with Americans who were in journalism or who claimed to be in journalism, who were obviously spooks or who were diplomats, were either real diplomats with the State Department or U.S. Agency for International Development or other agencies, but still had to interact with these people, had been all over the place. And I was immensely struck in the mid 70s when, if you read the American and the British media, Iran, and of course the Israelis, Iran was our friend. Not only was the Shah was our friend, but the Iranian people were Shias and therefore all moderates and lovers of America and Israel, not like those big bad Sunni Arabs who were obviously, it fitted into the myths that you were and background senses that you were talking about before, Pele. Persia is, they didn't call it Iran then, they called it still Persia. Persia has this great civilization. They're not dirty Arabs who don't appreciate we, the British, or we, the great, generous, loving, liberal Americans, New Deal Americans. Uh, they're Persians. They understand us. They love us. Da-da. But when you talk to American soldiers or diplomats, people who had actually been on the ground in Iran, or engineers, people who'd worked in the oil industry, people who'd worked on Peace Corps projects, and the whole spectrum, both the good and the bad, the innocent and the possibly sinister. Whoever you met, they all told me the same thing back in my 20s. And that is, don't put any money into Iran. Don't go there as a Westerner by yourself. They hate us like poison. Any American or Brit who wanders into the wrong bar or the wrong place at the wrong time disappears, and it's never pretty. And it all went back to Mossadegh, but not just to Mossadegh. It was what the Shah did. In the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson brought the best and worst of America, and the best turned out to be the worst too, the way they applied it there. He was a simplistic New Deal. He was a passionate supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted the best, as he imagined, for the peoples of the Middle East, both Arab and Iranian alike. So what's the best for them? First, that they should be strong and anti-communist and buy lots of American weapons and boost the sales and profits and stock prices of Lockheed. The amount of Lockheed money that went into shameless bribery to the Shah and the people around him alone is worth a separate show for us. It was astronomical. It was blown open by the church people and other 1970s investigators in the United States before the empire was resurrected under Reagan and the Iron Curtain on information came down again. But it was massive. That's the first point. But they also brought in what they thought was development. They industrialized Iran. They encouraged an overwhelmingly agricultural society with very low subsistence levels of existence, certainly. But they basically forced millions of people into cities. It was like Sovietization under Stalin in the 1920s. And it was done equally ruthlessly. And the Shah's own secret police, SAVAK, S-A-V-A-K, as I think you know very well, and you can probably might want to fill out much more details when I just give the outline, but they were a byword throughout the region for sadism and horror. Saddam Hussein and his people, who were monsters themselves in Baghdad and were extremely untypical at the time, it took them till 1979 to take power. And Saddam was always loathed and distrusted throughout the Arab world. He never had charismatic support, except for a very brief moment when it looked like he would get away with swallowing Kuwait in 1990. But he was always loathed because the Arab world was a much more decent and respectable place. You had two exceptionally ugly regimes, torture regimes, utterly ruthless, in Damascus under Hafiz Assad, and even he knew when to stop. He got on very well, significantly enough, with Yitzhak Rabin in Israel. That's a separate show I think we should do on another occasion because no one knows about it. The Rabin-Assad relationship and how it kept the peace in the Middle East for 40 years. But both of them in their own ways were not the people we thought they were. Rabin had very dark and disgusting sides to him. And Assad had, while he was totally ruthless, also had a much more positive side to him. But it was the Shah who gave Saddam and Assad a sense of freedom to give their own secret police forces even more unlimited support, because they could see Savak was killing on an enormous scale and torturing on an enormous scale. And the people of Iraq were terrified of Savak. Savak was seen by them as an equivalent of the SAS or the NKVD in the Soviet Union, and with very good reason. But it was supported by the United States, totally, 100%, uncritically. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon in particular revered the Shah of Iran. And then, of course, the Shah turned on them and bit them by going along with Saudi Arabia to wreck the Western world. The Shah did more damage to the Western economies than all the left-wing radical revolutionaries, Saddam, Assad, Nasser, in the United Middle East combined. He did much more damage by going along with America's other great ally, in the King Faisal, in the 1973-75 oil shock. So that's the first big key point. The second point, which flows from what you say too, is, and I think we should do a second show on this, and again, I know you know this backwards, and I know a great deal about it too, the Suez Crisis of 55-56, which is very well known, of course, but it plays a central role in the Great British Trauma. It's hugely traumatic for the English ruling class. It broke them in ways that the leaving India did not. They still subsisted for a decade under imperial dreams. And then the humiliation of Suez in 1956-57, when Nasser, backed by the Russians, faced them down, and Eisenhower refused to support them and cut them loose. An entire generation, the last generation of English imperialists, were traumatized by that forever. And that trauma shaped British helplessness on the world scene for 25 years, till a totally new generation under Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. And it took them even many years to reclaim a very serious place in the world, which they successfully did. But Suez was central. Everyone knows this. But the one extra point I want to add to this, and it is crucial, how is Suez flows out of Iran in 53. 53 was a successful coup from the American perspective. They got rid of Mossadegh and they thought they got away with it. And they saw the British, as you point out, had treated Iran monstrously and had created this monster for themselves, and that Mossadegh was not a monster, not remotely. And then they had the Shah, who played games with them after the coup. And they thought Nasser would play games with them in 1956 as well. And you find the very same specific senior CIA individuals, Allen Dulles, Angleton, Kermit Roosevelt, and several others too, the very same quote-unquote Arabists and Middle East quote-unquote specialists who ran the coup from the American side in 1953 against Mossadegh are 100% in Nasser's corner through 1956, and they support Nasser nationalizing the canal. Because, first of all, they want the British out of the Middle East. And it's exactly as you said, Pelle. There's a combination of reasons. First, because America wants to use the oil of the Middle East for themselves and not leave any for the Brits. Second, because they rightly see the Brits have been too imperialistic, too arrogant, too greedy. The Americans were relatively generous in dealing with the Saudis, and it's a model that stands them in good stead with the Saudis up to now. Trump is dissipating, I think, what is left of 90 years of goodwill there. But the American model in respecting the Saudi Arabs and the Gulf Arabs proved infinitely superior to the British racist model of treating the Iranian people like subhuman dirt. And of course, the even more condescending British view from that weird little twisted creep, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, a total fake, that, we, the British, are the real friends of the Arabs. The Arabs can't be trusted to rule themselves, but we will rule you and guide you. A separate show we can do is how the British actually murdered two successive kings of Iraq in succession. The first two kings of Iraq were eliminated by the British because although they came from outside Iraq and were distrusted by the peoples of Mesopotamia, there was no Iraqi identity in those days. One did develop later, which is a long and complex story too. It's real, but it developed later. But King Faisal the First and his successor, both of them made a terrible mistake of taking the well-being of the peoples of Mesopotamia, whom they ruled, seriously. And they were both conveniently eliminated by the Brits. They were both, and there were Iraqi investigative journalists in Baghdad who investigated this at the time. And of course, not a word of it ever appeared in the Manchester Guardian or in the London newspapers, that great center, or on the BBC, the great centers of free speech and freedom and democracy and championing the League of Nations. Not a word of any of this ever appeared in London or was raised. Not a single question was ever raised in the House of Commons, in the British Parliament, about this. But the Americans saw how the British had done, and they thought, we did much better in Iran, and it worked in Iran, and now the Shah's more in our pocket than the Brits. And Nasser is the same. He's a good fellow. Well, it turned out he wasn't such a good fellow. He might have been, because both the Dulles brothers, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and CIA director and the real mastermind of American world power, given full support, incidentally, huge full support by Dwight D. Eisenhower, they betted big on Nasser. And eventually they bungled their relations with Nasser. Nasser turned to the Soviet Union and encouraged pro-Soviet revolutions across the Arab world. And it took another 20 years for the Americans till eventually, under Nixon, Ford, and most of all Henry Kissinger, till with a few selective assassinations and lots of money poured in, they stopped the rot and rolled the Soviets back. They reestablished themselves in Saudi Arabia. They couldn't topple Saddam in Iraq for the reasons that you pointed out, the mullahs did as well. By then, the regime was too wise to Western imperial tricks and had their own dictatorship in place. And under Sadat, the Egyptians happily made a better deal for their own people with the United States than they had with the Soviets under Nasser. And I was there to actually see many of these things happen in the 1970s. But all of it stems from everything that you pointed out and what you describe and have uncovered and documented from my obviously limited perspective. But again, I was knocking around the region in the 70s. I was therefore able to learn and listen to the oral traditions of Western diplomats and Arab diplomats in the region at the time. And everything that I heard then, that really blew me away, and it took me decades to process much of it, you have confirmed and explained and put in a broader and explanatory context.